Thanks. So I went to school at Penn, so it's really a pleasure to be back in Philly. Here, I'm supposed to pull out sideways. Wow, you have to be really strong. Okay. So I'm a computer scientist by training, and what I wanted to do is talk to you about some of the work my group is doing on using social media data for public health in a variety of ways. What I thought I'd do is give you a sampling of things we're doing and let your imaginations fill in the blanks of how these techniques can be applied to problems that are of interest to you, and I'll concentrate on some of the health problems that are really dominant in cities and urban environments. So first of all, when I say social media data, web data, what do I mean? So many of you are familiar with these technologies, things like Twitter, Facebook, Google searches, people writing on forums across the web. So there are millions, billions, however you want to measure it, comments, searches, messages that happen all the time, every day. Probably since I started talking, people in this room have tweeted something. Really we're interested in how we can use these data in order to inform public health. And I'll give you examples of that. But what's interesting, I just wanted to point out, is a lot of times I get asked about the demographics of some of these groups, and do they reflect the population at large? And generally, they are overrepresentative of younger people and minority populations in cities. So for this room, this is a big advantage, that this is really focused on a lot of the areas that you guys care about. All right, so if you've heard anything about this, you've probably heard that we can predict the flu using whatever. There was a paper recently on predicting the flu using open table reservations, if you guys, right? So it's like, basically I have this joke that we should just like pick random things and show they can predict the flu. So lots of things predict the flu. That's probably what you've heard about. I have a lot of the papers on this area, but that's not what I want to talk about today because that's not what I think the real value is. I think the real value is looking at behavioral medicine. So this is how people's thoughts and behaviors affect their health. Right? So what is behavioral medicine? What does it impact? A lot of things like obesity, smoking, vaccinations, gun violence, drug use. The money is supposed to indicate it's illicit drug use. Generally, the cash does that. Anyway, so these are obviously issues that come up in cities quite a bit. And we've done work on a lot of these different areas and how social media and web data can be used to learn about different aspects of behavior around these topics. I'll mention, because it came up earlier, for gun violence, I was on an NSF panel after the Sandy Hook shooting, and we actually have a paper coming out in American Psychologist soon that talks about some uses of social media at studying violence in youths, including gun violence and possible opportunities for prediction. But I won't talk about gun violence much today. So why do I think web data is so good for these types of online data? For behavioral medicine. So behavioral medicine is often about things that you can't really get in the clinical environment, right? Like obesity is not about choices you make when you're sitting with your doctor, it's about choices you make on a daily basis, right? Same with drug use, right? Same with vaccines. A lot of the decision is made before you even see the doctor about whether or not you want your kids to get a vaccine. So a lot of these are decisions that people are making that impact their health. And the nice thing about web data is it's all about online activities that reflect these decisions and behaviors. So this is really a unique kind of data set to allow us to study these sorts of health topics. So let me give you a bunch of examples, and it will get your creative juices flowing. And if at the end of this you think, oh, well, I think your data and your approaches would be good for my problem, fantastic, come find me. All right, so let's start with awareness campaigns. Right? So awareness campaigns are the bread and butter of public health, especially in cities. I live in New York. I'm on sabbatical for the year. And so when you ride the subway, you see health ads all the time. I'm not talking about the plastic surgery ads. I'm talking about like from the NYC Health. You also see the plastic surgery ones. Right? These are critically important. And critically important also is their evaluation. The problem is the evaluations are really time-consuming and expensive. Sometimes the evaluations can be more expensive and time-consuming than the actual running of the campaign. Right? But you have to actually know if what you're doing is successful and you need to evaluate. So I think this is an opportunity where social media, web data have a huge impact because what we can do is we can evaluate campaigns quickly, cost-effectively, and very easily. So just so you one evaluation we did recently, this is skipping around. This is the Great American Smokeout. How many people have heard of that campaign? Right? Okay, good. Hopefully it's got you all to quit smoking. So this is a plot where the dashed lines represent the day of the Great American Smoking Campaign. I know it's a little hard to see. And the dotted lines is New Year's Day, which is also known to be associated with interest in quit smoking. And so what we've done here is we've looked at several years of the campaign, looking at a variety of data sets. So we look at news articles. How many news articles were there about cessation? How many people on Twitter were talking about the fact they wanted to quit? How many people went to Google and searched for how to quit smoking? How many people looked quit smoking up on Wikipedia? And how many people called quit lines, right? And these are really easy data sets to get. And we can quickly put together a bunch of these data sets, run a multi-year analysis, and actually answer the question, is the Great American Smokeout actually effective in getting people interested in quitting? Right? And so here's another version of that data where we show the increase in interest on these various platforms around the Great American Smokeout, measured by looking at the period of time immediately before and immediately after, where the little stars are statistical significance. So this is actually showing us how many more people are doing these searches or looking these things up online because of these efforts. So this is a really fast and easy way to evaluate campaigns. We've done this for a number of campaigns, it's just one. Let me give you another example. And this came up a lot in the morning session, which is mental health. And what I really liked hearing is mental health is critical to public health because there's broad social community implications, right? And so the problem is studying mental health from a public health standpoint is very difficult to do, right? So here's an example of a paper where they were looking at seasonal variations in mental health. This is in, I think, the Netherlands. And the point is, doing these sorts of studies is very, very difficult to do because it's very hard to get the data, right? And so there hasn't been a lot of work in this area. And so because it takes so long to get the data and so long to analyze it and understand, we can't capture what's happening now, and we can't understand if what we're doing, if various campaigns we're running or initiatives or policies are actually having the impacts that we desire. So believe it or not, social media can help in this as well. So if you go on Twitter, it's not too hard to find people who are writing things like this. This is a little bit on the extreme side. So today I started therapy. She diagnosed me with anorexia, depression, anxiety disorder, and actually 140 characters wasn't enough to put in all the diagnoses. But most tweets are more like this. I don't want to get out of bed, but I really need to get up and prepare myself for work, right? So I can't say this person's depressed, right? Because I feel like this a lot, and I don't think I'm depressed. But you can aggregate signal over lots of people, right? We do know that depressed people are more likely to say things like this. So we can't say anything about the individual, but looking at a whole population, we can actually make interesting inferences just by looking at data of what people write online. So I'll give you an example. We wanted to answer the question, is there a higher rate of post-traumatic stress disorder in the military? And we did this using Twitter data. What we did is we collected a large amount of data coming from US military bases and data coming from the public at large. I'm not going to go into the details of exactly how this is done, but lots of military bases, lots of people. And what we look for are signals of language that are correlated with post-traumatic stress disorder. And how we get those signals is another talk, right? And we simply ask the question, is there more signal coming from military bases? And the answer is yes, with some ridiculously small p-value. It's not a huge increase, so I didn't write the effect size, but there is an increase in the PTSD chatter and the signals, and it is definitely significant. Furthermore, we know that this is not uniformly in the military, right? You have a higher chance of developing post-traumatic stress disorder if you actually are in combat zones. So we divide these military bases into homeland missions and deployment overseas, what we call high and low deploy. And we see a very similar effect, that the high deploy areas have higher rates of PTSD, right? So this is something that we know, right? We know PTSD is more common in the military because they're in combat zones. That's not a surprise. But what's surprising is we can automate this analysis very easily using publicly available data. And obviously, it's much faster to do this than doing the standard ways of measuring this in the military, which sometimes take years. Let me give you another example that a lot of people here think about, I'm sure, which is smoking. And living in New York, the NYC Health has had a big focus on smoking the past couple years. Michael Bloomberg continues to through his foundation. So this is something I think quite a lot about. Smoking is still a huge problem. About 400,000 people die in the US every year, 5 million people throughout the world, and unless something changes, 1 billion people are going to die in the 21st century. Now that's a lot of people, but what's really amazing about this is 100% preventable. No one at birth is going to die from smoking, right? No one is born with a cigarette in their hand. This is all based on decisions people make. Right? And if people did not make the decision to smoke, they wouldn't die from smoking. And you can't say that almost about any other health issue. Right? Even vaccines, there's always a chance you can get vaccinated and still get the disease. Very, very small chance, but there's always a chance. Smoking, you will not die from smoking if you don't smoke and other people around you don't smoke. Right? That's a guarantee. So what can we do? One of the things that we want to understand if we want people to stop smoking is when do they want to smoke? When do people crave cigarettes? If we know, for example, that people crave cigarettes every day at 2 o'clock, I'm making up a number, right? That's when efforts to get people to stop, that's when they should kick in. That's when our intervention should happen, right? But how do you know when people crave cigarettes? So here's a study that was done a couple years ago. And basically what they did is they collected a population of about 300, 400 smokers, and they asked them to journal for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, right? And then they used those journals to measure when they were interested in smoking. Now, if you've ever done a study like this is a huge amount of work. Recruiting 400 smokers and getting them to journal accurately for 2 weeks is not a straightforward thing. We were able to do something very similar with using Twitter data where we looked at millions of people. And what we did is we looked for people who said things like, I need a cigarette, I want a cigarette, I need a smoke. And we used sophisticated language techniques to get all these variations. And we then looked, when do they say these things, at what time of day? And of course, normalizing for how much people talk on Twitter. Right? And the patterns that we found are not that interesting, but you can see there's a very definitive curve here. And this was very easy to generate, and we didn't need any people, and we have a much larger population than doing these small clinical trials. I'll give you another example in smoking. Electronic cigarettes. How many people have heard of these? Right, that's what I thought. How many people knew about them 5 years ago? No one? 2 people? Okay, good. So this is obviously a very new issue people care a lot about. We want to be able to track these, for example. So my colleagues had a paper in 2010, 2011 that said, hey, you know what? Electronic cigarettes are going to be a really big thing. We need to care about this. Judging by the show of hands, none of you guys had heard of them. And they made these predictions actually looking at search traffic. And they saw people were starting to search for these electronic cigarettes, and there were large increases. And they said, hey, this is going to be a really big thing. At the time, people were focused on other problems in tobacco. Since this has obviously become a very, very big issue. We, of course, can do something very similar using Twitter, where we look at tweets and how much people talk about electronic cigarettes. But actually, we can do something much, much more interesting using Twitter data. Right? So the FDA is gearing up to start regulating electronic cigarettes. And one of the things that matters a lot for regulation is why do people use them, right? Should we be regulating these as a tobacco cessation product? Are they actually a smoking product? What's the issue with kids? These are issues that you care about if you want to do regulation. These are actually issues that we can help answer using Twitter data, because we don't just know that people are interested in electronic cigarettes, but we have their whole tweet, so we can look at why they're interested in electronic cigarettes. And people write this all the time. So we looked at a bunch of data from Twitter, and we said, how many people write, I'm smoking electronic cigarette because I'm trying to quit, or they help me quit? And how many people write things like, I like the flavor, or they're cheaper and I can get around taxes? Right? And we can look at a lot of data, again, not talking to anyone, but looking at publicly available data, and start to answer these questions of why do they want to use it. So a lot of companies are advertising them as tobacco cessation products, and they want them to be regulated as such. But you see that's about less than 40% of the reasons people give. There are all these other reasons which are very worrisome. For those in tobacco control, things like flavor and positive image, that's not good. Right? We've spent 40 years trying to get rid of those things. Of course, we can also break this down. So we can look at Twitter data, and we don't just know what you're saying, but we know who you are, right? Because a lot of people share that information. So we can break down this analysis by gender, for example, right? And we can say, are there differences between why men and women smoke? In this case, there's not really differences. But I'll let your imagination run wild of the different sorts of analyses that you could do very, very easily with this data. So the argument I'm making here appeared in a paper we had in JAMA last year. Could behavioral medicine lead the web data revolution? You see there's a lot of words here, but the answer is yes. We should, I mean, we tried just to do yes, and they gave us more space, so what are you going to do? But I think, obviously, and the reason I'm here is because I think a lot of you have issues in which we can, using these techniques, make a big impact in what you do. Whether it's trying to understand why people make decisions in the population, trying to evaluate the effectiveness, trying to measure different trends in health or diseases. I think those are great opportunities for this sort of data. So a lot of people are responsible for what I've done, and plus much more. So I wanted to thank them. And if you want more information, please visit my website.